Hi, I'm Karen. We're here at Montevilla Sewing Center, and today we're going to talk about doing blind hem on the Janome 6700. Now, blind hem is where you don't see the stitches on the outside of your garment. They're just formed basically on the inside. Blind hemming in the old days was done by hand, and you can still do it by hand to get very fine stitching, but it's a lot more efficient if you use your sewing machine. The blind hem stitch is this. I have it programmed for number 7, so there it is right there. You can also find that in mode 2 if it's not on your screen here. We have other videos on how to program these buttons for the stitch that you use frequently. Blind hem is great for thicker fabrics, or like this is a fleece, and you can see the blind hem stitches right there. On the outside, you can't see those stitches at all. And the stitch has enough stretch. It's built in. Now there are 2 blind hem stitches that you could use. You have number 018 or 019. I've programmed in 018 on this one. And the reason why some people use the 019 is to give a little more stretch between the stitches. But I have found that for the most part, I don't really need that, because each one of these jog stitches in the 018 gives plenty of stretch, as you can see from my fleece example. So blind hem works well with your thicker fabrics, your fleeces, your wool blends, and also your busy prints. This is a busy print. This is quilting weight cotton, and you can't see, if you look really closely, I suppose you can see. I didn't quite match the thread exactly, but once I iron this, you could hardly see that at all. Now with your solid color, thinner fabrics, you can see those stitches. Now, I was pretty careful doing this. I've been blind hemming for quite a while. I still had a hard time making this truly invisible, even matching the thread almost exactly. So for your thinner fabrics, it might be better to use a different way to put up your hem. Or you could use a decorative stitch. I've done that too. Something that kind of shows off your hem rather than hiding it. Okay, so the question is, people think, how do I do knits? Well, on a blind hem for a knit, if you have a fairly stable knit like a fleece, it works great. But on something that's a little thinner like a jersey or some kind of a specialty knit, it's really hard to get a truly good blind hem. So in that case, I would suggest just doing a stitch. Now I've used contrast thread here, but it's kind of like a mock cover hem. Cover hem is when you buy a knitted garment, you'll see 2 rows of stitches, and then on the back side you'll see a row of thread that kind of goes back and forth, loops back and forth. That's a special machine that does that. Your machine does not do cover hem, but you can do sort of a mock cover hem. In that case, I'd suggest you go to mode 2, and it happens to be number 17, 017, but I'm going to just kind of page ahead here, 017. If I wanted to select that, I could either type it in down here or just move my cursor ahead using the stitch length button and push M, and there I go. That stitch there is this stitch here. Now it's a little bit stretched out because the knit feeds through the machine a little bit differently than a woven does. If I had white thread, you could hardly see it at all. And on the back, look how nicely that covers the edge. This would be really good for your jerseys that tend to curl outwards. That's why a cover stitch machine covers that edge and keeps it curling. Okay, but let's get back into blind hem. So I'm using contrast thread so that you can see what I'm doing here. Normally, like for this, I'd use a brown that's the exact same brown. So the first thing we want to do is we want to finish this edge, because it's a raw edge. It's going to keep fraying if we don't finish that. And I would recommend in your sewing, always finish your raw edges if you're planning on washing whatever you're sewing. Okay, if you have something that's going to fray, that is. Okay, so we're going to go to zigzag right here and put that down there. Move that over a little bit. Here we go. Okay, and it gives us a locking stitch right at the beginning. Watching what I'm doing. This is one of those situations you want to watch where what the needle's doing, as opposed to watching a guide or something. Now I'm going to do a locking stitch at the end. If you look right here, the needle is past the edge of the fabric. I don't want to do a locking stitch there because the lock won't form if it's just kind of stitching in the air. So I'm going to come up, and if my machine had stopped with the needle down, all I would need to do is push the locking stitch, keep my foot on the pedal until it stops. And in this case, I've got the, in settings, I turned on the thread cutter. It will automatically cut the threads right after we're done. So that's a nice finished edge. Then you want to go over to or figure out where you want your hem, and go over to your iron and iron that hem. I'm going to get my pins here. So iron your hem where you want it to be. And then we're going to start pinning it. And I pin it, probably about a scant 3/8 inch from the edge, maybe a generous 1/4 inch. I guess we could get down into 1/16 inches, but I don't like to go there if I have to, if I can avoid it. Okay, so then you want to fold this over. So here's the way it's going to be finished, right? Okay, so you fold this over so you have this kind of flange thing here. That's what most of your stitches are going to be on. So let's go over here to stitch number 7. Most of your stitches are going to be on the flange, and that little jog stitch is just going to catch that edge there. So here we go. Take that right there. Pull it out the other side, and notice I'm burying the points of my pins there. Believe me, it helps keep the blood off your project, if you get my drift. So it's to kind of protect you and protect everything else. Okay. And use long enough pins that it can get through all those layers, because you're going through 3 layers here. Okay, make sure you don't leave any pins on the other side, and keep the pins far enough away. Now notice I have them going this way, which is parallel to the line of stitching, not crossways. That way I don't have to pull them out right before I stitch. This way I can keep sewing right up next to the pin, and the pin keeps doing what it's supposed to do, and then I can take it out before I get to the head of the pin. Okay, now for doing a blind hem, your machine comes with this foot here, the G foot. I personally don't prefer using this. I think this foot works a little bit. I like how this works because it has an adjustability factor, whereas you don't really have a whole lot of, with that little thing in the middle, you don't have a whole lot of ability to adjust your stitch. You can to a certain extent, but this I like much better. And there's nothing in there to, I mean, you can adjust your stitch width if you want. I usually like to leave the stitch width where it is, but you can, depending on the thickness of your fabric, you can adjust this little flange. See, this one has that little flange there too. So we're going to use my accessory that I purchased separately. Change your feet, pretty easy. Like that, there we go. Now I'm going to have to figure out where this should be based on the thickness of my fabric. Now when you first get into this stitch, your first stitch is going to go right there. It's still going to give you a locking stitch to start with, but it's not going to give you a locking stitch where it's going to sew through a lot of layers of fabric. Right now I can tell, I don't know if you can see what I'm doing, but it's going to take a little bit too big of a bite into the fabric. So I'm going to move this flange, this guide over a little bit so I can just barely get a little bit. Doing a blind hem is a little bit like learning to drive. You need to kind of practice it and get better. You don't want to have your stitches so wide that they show, even on some of these ones that they shouldn't show on. You don't want to have it so narrow that it actually misses this and leaves a gap where you don't have any stitches. So it's something to kind of practice. This foot here makes it a lot easier to practice on that. Another thing I should mention again, when you get an accessory foot like this, make sure that you have it to fit your machine. You don't want to get just a generic one. Notice how this, the stitch hole here is curved. That matches your other, like on your A foot, see how that's slightly curved? You don't want one that's flat across there, so avoid getting generic feet. It's best to get the Janome feet. Also, this machine has the capability of doing a 9mm maximum width of the stitch. So the bar where the ankle fits needs to be 9mm. You can't get a 7mm because that's not going to fit on your machine. So 9mm, put that right on there, put this right under here, and we're ready to get started. So that first stitch is going to be in the fabric, and then it stitches off to the side. I'm going to go real slow so you can watch what it does. It does its locking stitch automatically, and then it starts marching forward, and then it does a stitch into the fabric, and that's where it's going to hold those layers together. I have about a 1/4 of an inch. You could make it slightly more than a 1/4 of an inch. What you don't want to have is these little stitches. Let's see if I can point a little bit better here. You don't want to have these long straight stitches being out past the edge of your fabric. You want to have them into the fabric. You don't want to have such a big flange that it just flops out, but you also don't want to have it too narrow so that you're not stitching on fabric. Again, trial and error, practice. You'll get better as you practice. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit here. And the speed slider is great for learning any new technique. You can slow it down to get adequate control for however you need it. Now, what you're going to be watching for to start with is to make sure that the needle's actually going into the fabric. I'm going to back off a little bit because I think it wasn't quite going into the fabric. Then, when you're doing blind hem, this fold needs to be right next to that. Not bubbling up against it, not away from it, but just skimming it, just nice and evenly. So go ahead and stitch several stitches. Now about this time I'm going to take my pin out, stitch enough stitches so that you can tell, see, with needle down I can lift this up, turn this, and make sure that it's actually stitching into the fabric. You can take a look on the other side and see what it looks like. Those stitches look a little big to me, so I think I might back it off, and moving the guide this way to the left a little bit. Okay. So if you're doing like a skirt, you might decide that much of your stitches were either too far this way or too far that way. You can easily take those stitches out using a seam ripper. I'll show you that in a minute too. I'm going to stitch all the way down here. Notice, remember, I'm watching right there. Right there. And then if you wanted to stop, you don't want to have your locking stitch be in this flange here. Also, if you did your locking stitch right now, it would continue stitching till it got to the end of the stitch cycle, which means like you would get all the way through there. But if you're done, or you're the end of your fabric and you don't want to go off the edge or whatever, then use this one instead. So notice where my needle is. It's into the flange. It's not into that extra little fold I made. So just do that one. Push down on the pedal. It'll do a locking stitch immediately. And there, cut the thread for me. Take this out. Okay. Again, I'm using contrast thread. But if I was using that dark brown thread, you wouldn't see those at all. Now what you also want to do is check your stitches. Kind of run your finger along here to make sure you haven't missed anything. Over here I didn't sew it at all, but you could tell if you have missed something, and then you can go back and stitch that part again, maybe moving the flange over a little bit. So that is blind hem, and again, practice, be patient with yourself. Eventually you'll get it. And once you're done with something like this, you want to press your hem. I would suggest you press it from this side. And the reason why you want to press it, because this edge you've already pressed, but you want to get that extra little fold out. I found it best, especially on thick fabrics, not to press from the top, because then you get a ridge there. So press from the inside and you'll get a nice flat seam that's, you hardly see it on the outside at all. So if this video has been helpful to you, give us a thumbs up. If you have questions or comments, you can leave them in the comment section down below. We have lots of other videos on this machine, and so stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Thanks. Bye.